Tonight on Cross Currents, crimes of war, the shocking story of Nazi atrocities along the Eastern Front during the Second World War. Many of those responsible now live peacefully in the West. Can they and should they be brought to justice? Cross Currents with Jim Carney.
Nearly half a century after the Second World War, a huge moral question still resonates, a cloud of doubt that casts a shadow across the lives of all of us. Have we done everything possible to bring to justice all those who took part in the mass slaughter of millions of people in Europe during those few terrible years in the early 1940s? The answer most certainly is no. There is general agreement on some basic facts. One, it's estimated that between 1940 and 1945, some 11 million people, civilians, were deliberately and systematically murdered by Nazi and pro-Nazi groups. Approximately 6 million of the victims were Jews. Two, most of the killing took place within those countries between the Baltic and Black Seas, including Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, and the Ukraine. Three, much of the killing was done by citizens of those countries working with the German occupying forces. Four, following the war, many of these individuals emigrated to Western countries where they acquired jobs and citizenship, raised families, and, one assumes, lived reasonably comfortable lives. Five, the governments of these Western countries have done surprisingly little to identify these individuals and bring them to justice. Tonight's film, made by Scottish Television, focuses on two men who the film alleges committed atrocities in Lithuania and the Ukraine. After the war, they emigrated to England. According to the film, not only has Britain never brought charges against any alleged war criminal living in England, it has never even passed legislation allowing it to do so. It seems shocking. Yet from the British government's point of view, these cases present complex legal and technical problems, and also raise deep moral issues. Ask yourself these questions from a Canadian point of view. Do you think that a Canadian court should have jurisdiction over an alleged crime committed in another country years and years ago by a person who was not a Canadian citizen at the time? Do you think that Canada should sign an extradition treaty with any country that has a different legal system, where, for instance, witnesses may be coerced for political reasons, and where an individual may not get a fair trial as we define it? Or, where an extradition treaty exists, do you think we should send someone, a Canadian citizen, to another country for trial, knowing we are probably sending them to their death? In recent years, the government of Canada has tried to come to terms with some of these issues, most notably with the Deschênes Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals in 1985 and 86. We'll look briefly at the results of that inquiry following our film. Because tonight's film may generate some pain and anger, I'd ask you to bear three things in mind. First, all of the countries discussed in the film have experienced decades, even centuries, of foreign oppression and political turmoil. Most citizens of these countries are passionate nationalists, and many saw cooperation with the Germans as their only hope for escaping Soviet domination and communism. Second, in the chaos that was Europe immediately after the war, devastated and teeming with millions of refugees, it was impossible for the Western powers to thoroughly search the background of every individual who applied to emigrate. Third, Nazism was dead. Communism was perceived as the new threat. Immigration procedures had only one preoccupation: to watch for communists and communist sympathizers. And after all, the most passionate and knowledgeable anti-communists in the world were former Nazis and the emigres from Eastern Europe. Tonight's film is called Crimes of War. It deals with one of the most contentious and sensitive issues that can be raised, but that is no reason to ignore it.
The war was terrible. There were 55 million victims during the last war. The Soviet Union suffered 20 million victims, and of course that calls for the punishment of those responsible.
There are now at least 51 alleged war criminals living in Britain. All of them are wanted by the Soviet Union. So far, Britain has done nothing about them. But here on the 31st of March in Moscow, Mrs. Thatcher said that she wanted evidence. We've come to find out what evidence there is. We've also found out what the Soviet Union intend to do about them.
Giseviches lives in Britain and is very strongly suspected of crimes in the territory of Lithuania in Russia during the war. At present, an investigation is taking place in this country, and as a result, we shall put the question before the British authorities to extradite Giseviches.
The people were usually standing in the pits. They stood in rows, and the soldiers would shoot into their backs.
I recognized my husband by his clothes. How else could I have recognized him? His face was covered in blood, and he was all holes and blood.
Speaking legally, there are no terms for these crimes to be forgiven or to be forgotten. Giseviches used his pistol, which he took out from his holster, and finished off the victims who were still alive.
Savarich took children from their mothers and shot them with a pistol and threw them into the pit. Giseviches and Savarich committed crimes on Soviet territory. Crimes against Soviet citizens, old men, women and children. And it is on this issue that they should be tried by Soviet law.
We went to the Home Secretary. I must tell you that we were told in a document that he provided for us, provided by his staff, I suppose, but agreed by him, that given the nature of the Soviet Union, there was no question of sending anybody back to the Soviet Union.
It may seem strange to us, and perhaps even wrong, that the Soviet Union cannot forget Nazi war crimes 40 years after the war. But you only have to come to a place like this, the village of Hatyn in Belarus, to understand why. The figures behind these bars represent the number of people who were murdered at the Malyutrastinets concentration camp in Belarus near Minsk. There were 260 such camps in the Republic.
In the summer of 1943, the Nazis came to this village to ruin it. They killed 175 people, old people, women, children. They gathered them in the barn and burned them alive in this barn. The village was never reconstructed. Like all these villages, it is now dead, like Hatyn.
More than 2.25 million people were murdered in this one republic alone. These were not soldiers killed in action, or people killed in air raids or caught in artillery fire, but men, women and children murdered in cold blood. In all, 1 in 4 of the population died in this manner. But Belarus is not alone either. The same atrocities on the same scale took place in the Soviet republics bordering German-occupied Poland. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Ukraine suffered the same fate as they came under German rule. In all, the Soviet Union lost more than 20 million people in the war. The scale and manner of their deaths explains why they cannot forget. The bells of Hatyn ring out, not just in remembrance, but also for justice. This pursuit of justice started within months of the war ending. At Nuremberg, the chief Soviet prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, called for it.
We have no right to forget the sacrifices sustained. We have no right to leave unpunished the perpetrators and organizers of the monstrous crimes. Let justice be done.
Justice has always been pursued. It still goes on, and not just in the Soviet Union. Klaus Barbie has been convicted of war crimes in France. John Demanjuk was expelled from America to Israel for trial. Karl Linus was deported from America to Estonia, where he had already been tried in absentia and found guilty. And Canada tabled a bill in its parliament so that Nazi war criminals found living there could be put on trial in Canadian courts.
I think it is a pretty impressive and important step in the history of our country to ensure that Canada is recognized as a country which is not a haven for war criminals.
But one country stands alone. There has never been a war criminal extradited from Great Britain. There has never been a war crimes investigation in Great Britain. There has never been a war crimes trial in Great Britain.
Say the commandant of Auschwitz, Obersturmbannführer Rudolf Höss, who was commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they probably got rid of, by gassing alone, I'm not talking about petrol injections, hanging, flogging, starvation, but they probably got rid by gassing alone of 4 and 4.5 million, according to the records available. If that man had appeared in Great Britain tomorrow, and there was evidence available in shows, and he'd admitted the whole thing, we could have done nothing. We have not legislated for the trial of German war criminals, or indeed Japanese war criminals, in the United Kingdom. Not one single German war criminal, or for that matter Japanese war criminal, was tried in the United Kingdom.
Yet some did get into Great Britain. Thousands of decent and genuine displaced persons were given refuge in this country just after the war. But they unwittingly provided cover for men accused of some appalling crimes.
They lied in entering Great Britain. If they are suspected war criminals, they didn't state their previous role when they entered the country, so they're not entitled to any protection under the law.
The Simon Wiesenthal Centre, named after its founder, has been the most successful Nazi hunting organisation in the world. From their own investigations, they have a list of 17 alleged war criminals living in Britain. These they discussed with Douglas Hurd, Home Secretary, on March the 2nd, 1987. The alleged crimes all took place in the Soviet Union. The search for Nazi war criminals in the Soviet Union has never stopped. 60 have been found, tried and sentenced in the last 5 years alone. The Soviet Union also have a list of alleged war criminals they are still looking for. It's being investigated here at the Office of the Prosecutor General in Moscow.
We, on our part, have a list of 34 war criminals in the territory of Great Britain. We could have coordinated these two lists and could have worked together on the issue, as we are doing in the case with other countries. Unfortunately, we have had no help from Great Britain.
We don't have effective extradition arrangements with the Soviet Union, and I made it clear that we wouldn't in any case consider sending people back to face trial in the Soviet Union.
It has always been suggested that demands from the Soviet Union were not really demands to bring a war criminal to justice. The standard answer, which I think is a bit outdated now, was, oh, that's in order because they want to make him a victim of their communist spite over some political aptitude that he's adopted in the past. We're entering into a new era of extradition law, in which at the moment we stand very much on our own in the United Kingdom.
Mrs. Thatcher, when she took a press conference in Moscow at the end of March 1987, emphasised that Britain's present position against extradition to the Soviet Union will continue.
Well, first, I believe we have no effective extradition treaty with the Soviet Union. Secondly, we have a list of names. We do not have evidence, strict evidence, against those names. Any question of extradition could only arise on the basis of evidence and not on accusation.
Mr. Gekius is accused of mass murder. He lives in Edinburgh, where he admitted that his group, the 2nd Lithuanian Battalion, participated in the mass liquidation of Jews, only he claims that he was always on the side on guard duty. Our information is that the whole unit did nothing for a living but kill civilians, and he was the platoon commander.
That accusation by the Wiesenthal Center is supported by the Soviet Union. Documents and eyewitnesses there claim that Antanas Gikas was involved in the mass murder of men, women and children in Lithuania and Belarusia. He lives here in this residential area of Edinburgh, and he's wanted under the name which he used during the war and which he admits to, Antanas Gicevičius. It was an admission he made in a statement at his home in 1982. He was being interviewed by the Office of Special Investigations of the United States government. They wanted to gather evidence against a former colleague of Gicevičius in the Lithuanian police battalion who'd been found living in America, Jurgis Juodis. So there is no question of mistaken identity, as Mr. Gikas accepted in an interview when he was first named in October 1986.
During the war, I was a soldier with the Lithuanian forces, 12th Lithuanian Battalion, and I was platoon commander, lieutenant.
But you are innocent?
Innocent.
Of all war crimes?
Of all war crimes.
I can tell you that our documents show that Gicevičius served in the 12th Battalion, and they prove what crimes he had committed while serving in the 12th Battalion. For instance, in this file there is a report dating back to the 26th of August 1941, and signed by the commander of the battalion, Impalavičius. It says that Gicevičius was appointed commander of the 3rd Group of the 1st Company of this battalion. In 1962, during the trial process, Kamzura, commander of the company in which Gicevičius served, witnessed. In Kaidanova was dug a big pit. People in groups, 10 or 20 persons at once, were taken to the edge of the pit and then were executed. The place was surrounded by Germans and soldiers who were executing people. They did it of their own will. Gicevičius was among them.
The war began in Lithuania, not in 1939, but in 1941, when the Germans broke the peace treaty with the Soviet Union and swept into Lithuania. Surprisingly, they were welcomed by many of the people who saw the German invasion as an opportunity to fight communism. Lithuania had only become a Soviet republic in 1940, so the Nazis found many recruits and collaborators. They formed police battalions, made up from these local people to control the areas they invaded. It was in one of these battalions that Antanas Gicevičius, Lithuanian born and bred, was an officer. The Germans and the police battalions soon showed how they intended to treat the population.
The Germans continued the execution of the people throughout the 3 years of the German occupation. And each day they would bring hundreds of men, women, and children to the camp of Paneriai. Those people did not even suspect that they were to be exterminated. The Germans would take them to the edge of the pit, they stripped them, and after those people were shot, they were thrown straight into the pits. There were 7 pits all in all that the Germans made use of. The total number of people who were buried in those pits amounted to 100,000.
The 100,000 murders at Paneriai were echoed here at Kaunas, a few kilometers away. Kaunas was ringed by ancient forts, which at the outbreak of war were used as prisons, prisons which became death camps. The 9th fort was the scene of the mass murder of 80,000 Jews who were transported there from all over Europe. This list, compiled by the Germans and sent to Berlin, shows that within 2 weeks of the invasion of Lithuania at the 7th fort in Kaunas, 463 Jews were killed. Just 2 days later, over 2,500 were murdered. And within 6 months, the end of 1941, 137,000 had been exterminated in Lithuania. Kaunas, with its ghetto, was where Gicevičius and his battalion were posted, a fact which he admits in his own 1982 statement. The case against him has been mounted in the city.
Why did we only get interested in Gicevičius now, after such a long time? Well, at first I can tell you there were many people still living in Lithuania who had committed war crimes. So first of all, we put those people on trial. Later on, we tried to find others who had either died or fled the country. The name of Gisevičius was picked up for the first time some 25 years ago. At that time, there was a trial of several people who had served in the 12th Battalion under the command of Impalavičius. During the trial, the name of Gisevičius was mentioned over 40 times. I remember the trial of another lieutenant, Plunge, who witnessed that Gisevičius had executed people himself. The same had been proved by 3 more people on trial. They point out that Gisevičius had been one of the most cruel persons in that battalion.
Vytautas Zimantas is a recognized Soviet expert in war crimes investigations and is an author on the subject. He has investigated cases throughout Lithuania and has covered war crimes trials since 1962.
In the Kaunas 7th Fort, a group of Kaunas Jews were executed. The execution was carried out by Germans. The battalion of Impalavičius was also participating there.
Kazis Adamaitis was one of the soldiers in the battalion at that time. He has already served a sentence for murders committed here at the 7th Fort.
When I met Adamaitis for the first time, he was a sick man. He lived alone, and he didn't talk with me too much. But he mentioned the name of Gisevičius, and he said that Gisevičius executed people himself. They were lying here and there. Then they came and shot them there.
He recalled an incident when men and women, old people and children were brought to the square of the fort. The soldiers drove groups of people to the pit. In command were Gisevičius, Pukas and Jorgis Jodas. They gave orders to fire. In total, there were 8,000 Jews murdered here at the 7th Fort. Gisevičius's battalion was sent south from Lithuania to Minsk in Byelarussia in October 1941, as this captured German document shows. Order number 42 of the 4th of October 1941 states, "The Commandant of Kaunas orders the 2nd Battalion on the 6th of October at 500 hours to march to Minsk, Borisov and Slutsk provinces to cleanse the area of the remaining Bolsheviks and Bolshevik partisans. Among the officers in command were Sub-Lieutenant Jonas Plunge and Sub-Lieutenant Antanas Gisevičius." The impact in the Republic of Byelarussia was immediate.
After the German occupation, the German forces established the German region, under the terms of which the orders were to kill up to 70% of the population of Byelarussia by different means. In the territory of Byelarussia during the war, more than 2,300,000 people were killed. This means 1 in 4 of its pre-war population. In the Minsk ghetto, 42,000 Jews were killed. But that is a small figure compared to Malotrustanets, where 206,500 people were killed.
Antanas Gisevičius vehemently denies any personal involvement in the murders. He admits, though, in his 1982 statement that he was present and that the purpose was to clean out partisans. He also denies taking part in another mass killing in Minsk.
We arrived to the Minsk and then we noticed the crews, television crews and German propaganda units taking pictures. And then we noticed Germans taking these people to start the hanging. I've seen 3 hanging, but we were all the time stationary in the middle of the town.
So you deny any involvement?
Absolutely. I never assigned. The Germans, Lithuanians didn't hang. I'm telling you that we had nothing. We were the only parade standing, and the Germans were doing hanging.
But that was flatly contradicted by evidence at a trial in 1962, when a witness called Josas Kniramas, a soldier in his battalion, testified, "On our way, Lieutenant Gisevičius assigned the soldiers who were to act as hangmen. He chose Varnus, Simonis and me. I saw Varnus placing ropes around the necks of the condemned. One of them broke loose. I picked him up and we held him while Varnus tied the knot again. After this we went to the other place. Here people were hanged from the beams of 2 telegraph poles. I myself hanged a woman.
This probably witness was in Lithuania. He was in Lithuania, so Russians told him say that he told what Russians told him to say. They had no option. If they want to accuse you, they fabricate any evidence they want.
And yet this photograph, captured from the Germans, who had a bizarre fetish for recording such events, shows Gitsevich's own battalion commander, Major Impelavicius, personally hanging people in the streets of Minsk.
Although many witnesses that took part in the trial in 1962 are not alive anymore, we still found several eyewitnesses. I can mention witness Alexinus, witness Magonis, witness Miskevichus. They witnessed that they had served together with Gisevichus in the same battalion, and they say that Gisevichus not only commanded the group of soldiers, but also executed people himself.
Joseph Alexinus was a sergeant under Gitsevichus. He has already served 10 years in Siberia for his part in the battalion's war crimes.
I remember there were plenty of Jews killed in Minsk. They were taken in a column to the place of mass execution, 4 in a row. And the execution lasted for 2 days, and I think there were thousands of people executed there. Groups of soldiers were filed up close to the pit. They were commanded by officers. Our group was commanded by Gisevichus. He gave us orders, attention, and fire. Gisevichus used his pistol, which he took out from the holster, and finished off the victims who were still alive. When we served together in the battalion, he was my direct commander. So I think during these 6 months, or something like that, I knew him quite well.
Have you told the truth?
I have told you the truth about what I am remembering. I am not inventing anything.
Former members of the battalion, themselves Lithuanians, still live in the region where the atrocities were committed, by them against their own people. One soldier who served under Gitsevichus lives in the heart of Kaunas. He is Leonis Miskevichus. He has served a lengthy sentence in Siberia for his part in war crimes, and his sworn testimony is very detailed against his former officer.
In the fall of the same year, together with soldiers of the 12th Battalion, I was taken to shoot Jews in the city of Kletsk. 700 Jews were taken to the central square of the town. The Jews were walked outside of the city, maybe 1.5 kilometers away. They were shot near a hill, where there had been dug a pit. I was in guard, and I saw how the Jews were laid in the pit, and soldiers, following Gisevich's command, were shooting them with rifles. After the execution, Gisevichus and several other soldiers were checking who could still remain alive. If they found any, they would kill them. That's all. He used a German machine gun and used it like a pistol. He couldn't fire like sowing seeds because there were other soldiers around. So he had to use it like a pistol, just shooting separate shots.
Has anyone forced you to make this statement?
Nobody is forcing me. I am telling what happened in real life.
Even more innocent people, 8,000 who are mostly Jews, were killed in a forest just outside the town of Slutsk, 50 miles from Minsk. The Jews taken from the Slutsk ghetto were brought here. Mutiesa Magonis, who served under Gitsevichus, has already completed a long prison sentence in Siberia for his part in the murders.
The second case I remember is one where Jews were mass executed in Slutsk. That was the end of October 1941. Together with officers and soldiers of the 12th Battalion and some German soldiers, several thousand people were executed. Well, I recognize the place because I know the approximate distance, and I know the direction of where people were taken from. At this place nearby were trenches, and I know that there were shootings at this very place. Gazevicius was the officer. He himself was not only giving orders, but he was also carrying a revolver, and there were cases where he would shoot people himself.
What did I find? I found dead bodies here, and my husband dead, and that was all. Nothing else.
How had your husband been murdered?
From the rifle, maybe from the revolver. One bullet was in his forehead, the other one in his neck. There were many people lying here. There were trenches with people lying here, but I was not looking around. I was just looking at my grief.
I consulted the documents from the trial of Plungay, which testify to the fact that the 12th Battalion were involved in the events that took place here. There were soldiers and officers from the 1st Company under the command of Kamzura, where the commanders of platoons were Gazevicius and Plungay. In 1979, Plungay was sentenced to death, and one of the crimes that was taken into account when passing this sentence was the fact that he participated in the mass shooting that took place here.
The battalion's behaviour in Slutsk made the local SS demand that their senior officer protest directly to Hitler. They complained of indescribable brutality by Lithuanian partisans.
That, as I say, that's what they could make whatever story they want to show as awful as possible. They could take, where is this, the witness? Is Russians have, this is the Russians, what the Russians keep telling all the time, because whatever they want, they could make any story.
I'm going to show you 8 photographs. Tell me if you recognize anyone in these photographs. Who is this man?
Kas šitas vyras?
Šitas Gecevičius.
This is Gecevičius.
The conduct of Gecevicius had not gone unnoticed or unrewarded by his German masters. He was promoted to lieutenant, along with Jonas Plungay, with effect from the 1st of January 1943 by the Commandant of Police at Kaunas. He was also awarded the Iron Cross, which was unusual, as it was normally given only to German nationals.
And I've got Iron Cross for fighting Russians. You see, Iron Cross is a hand-to-hand battle. And I had a hand when I was on patrol. We were attacked by Russian patrol in a hand-to-hand battle.
And this is the German Iron Cross?
German Iron Cross.
And who gave you that award?
German, from the German headquarters must be so.
He also received a special police medal, an award which the Germans gave to local collaborators who helped keep the civilian population under control.
German forces established special awards and special medals for those who were supporting the regime. They were the so-called medals for the active struggle against partisans. But we all know that was just a pretext. And actually, these were for murder, for mass executions.
Here
are the documents, the fascist documents that we got. In them, several names are called. Among them, Gazevicius, who served in the 12th Battalion and who was awarded such a medal.
We offered to put this new information to Mr. Gikas, but he declined. The Soviet Union, however, want to put it to him in court.
Although the preliminary investigation is still in process, we hope that Gazevicius will be extradited from Great Britain, and we will put him on trial here in the Soviet Union.
All of the information against Antanas Gecevicius is being gathered here in Moscow at the office of the Prosecutor General of the Soviet Union.
I can only stress again that the investigation is a very serious one. And as a result of this investigation, we shall put the question before the British authorities to extradite Gaceviches.
There is no extradition treaty with the Soviet Union at this moment, and there never has been. I don't think there's ever been an extradition treaty with Russia, not even in the Tsar's days. And until the law is altered by Act of Parliament, which is the only way to alter the law of England, thus it will remain.
27 people were shot, then burned to death here at a wedding party on the 13th of February 1944 by Germans and a local policeman. And he was involved in a further 113 murders. His name was Kirill Zavarich. After the war, he escaped to a country where, as a Soviet war criminal, he was safe from justice. That country was Great Britain. Zavarich's crimes were committed here in his native Ukraine. In the war, more than 5,400,000 Ukrainians were killed. Another 2 million were deported to labor camps in Germany. And yet, the Germans weren't without their allies in this republic. As in Lithuania, they created local police battalions to help control the population. Zavarich was a willing recruit. Based at this police station in Zaboloty, he committed crimes against his own people. This is where he grew up, and the people he attacked were the people he'd grown up with. One of his crimes was committed here in 1944 at the tiny village of Tur. A christening party was taking place at Christmas. Zavarich wasn't invited, but had arrived nonetheless. He sat at a table in this house, took out his pistol, and shot a man who was a guest.
And I came to this room, and Zavarich asked me, "Who are you?" And I said, "I am his sister." And he said, "Well, if you are his sister, you should bury him tomorrow, but not in the cemetery, but like a dog."
My mother
is quite old. She is 81 and already she forgets a lot of things, but I won't forget these things. I was 11 at the time. I remember very well how I was playing with the girls in the village, and then people started rushing out of this house, crying. My uncle was shot, and we ran to this house, and when we entered, Zavarich was walking around the room. My uncle was sitting like this, and there was a stream of blood going on the floor.
The next day, when the victim was to be buried, an even worse crime took place. Despite what Zavarich had said, the family wanted to give the man a decent burial in the local cemetery.
A couple came to bury my brother. Zavarich was hiding in the bushes. He came out and killed them. First he killed the husband, shooting him in the back of the head, and then he shot the wife in the back. And she was still alive. He came up to her, turned her over, and shot her in the head. My mother knew Zavarich very well. My mother lived in the same village of Zaboloty and married a man from the village.
We started the criminal case of Zavarich in 1971 because it was in that year that his place of residence was established as Great Britain. The first reason for beginning this case was the letter from Ukrainian citizens in Great Britain who knew Zavarich and knew his crimes during the war. Those people who sent us the letter were born in the same place, in the Zaboloty region. That is why they knew Zavarich as a person. They knew that he was living in Britain under the name of Petrovsky. We established 9 cases of execution of Soviet citizens by Zavarich and other criminals with whom he worked during the war, including the execution in Zaboloty, in Rosheshevuzi.
In this forest in the summer of 1942, Zavarich and 2 German soldiers took 8 people, including 2 babies, to a clearing. What happened next was witnessed by Efrosinia Bilichuk.
In 1941, I went with my husband to the village of Huta, and we walked by this route. And my husband said, "Listen, I hear German voices." And I became frightened, and I thought, my God, they're going to shoot us. So we dropped our bag on the other side of the road, and we lay down there. There was no forest here at that time. It was a rye field, so we could see it all very clearly. We could see that Zavaric was standing here, and the victims were standing there, and the two Germans there. And Zavaric said to Nikolai Glushuk to get into the pit, and Nikolai was refusing to go into the pit. Zavaric was shouting at him rudely, "Get into it." And then the Germans killed him, and then they shot all three families. Zavaric took children from their mothers, held them by the legs, and shot them with a pistol, and threw them into the pit. I know Zavaric very well. I could have recognized him even now after so many years because we were neighbors. I knew him when he got married. I knew him when he was a young boy.
On the crimes of Zavaric, we interrogated about 50 witnesses and more than 10 victims who had survived. We also have the material evidence. As a result of excavation of the bodies, we found the bullets with which victims were killed. In total, with the participation of Zavaric, more than 140 people were killed, besides which he personally killed around 30 people.
In February 1944, at the isolated village of Yarovic, 49 people gathered in one house to celebrate a wedding.
We came to play at the wedding, and we played for 2 days. We were in a big hall because it was winter, and then the Germans came, and they surrounded this place. From here they came, from that side, and they came by the road, and they placed their machine guns here and started to shoot.
They said that Zavaric was shooting. We realized we were not going to be safe in that room. So with the bride, we rushed to the cellar under the floor. And at that moment, she said, "When we were at your wedding, it was all right. But look what has happened at my wedding." But I couldn't talk to her because someone threw a grenade into the house and the bride was killed.
They killed my father and my brother, and my sister was burned in that house. The next day, my mother and myself went to the house, which had burned down, and could only recognize our sister by the pieces of her dress and bones and pieces of flesh.
$27.
27 people were killed here, also many wounded, but 27 were killed.
And now I am asking you, please send us Zavaric. You know how terrible it was for people. They were burning in the fire. When we burn our fingers, you know what pain it is. They were burning bone by bone. No. Somehow, something has to be done to bring him back. He has to be punished, that's all I have to say.
In 1972, the Foreign Office of the USSR sent a note to the British government asking for the extradition of Zavaric. But they didn't receive a reply.
The Soviet Union weren't given Zavaric for trial. In fact, they weren't even given a reply by the Foreign Office, despite eyewitness testimony taken from 76 people concerning the murders carried out by a man who'd found refuge in Great Britain. To clarify the point, we asked the Foreign Office in June 1987 what action they had taken about the Zavaric case. They said, "We didn't bother looking at it. There was no inquiry. There was no point. We have no extradition treaty with the Soviet Union." So Zavaric continued to live in Bolton under his assumed name, Petrovsky. But the people of the Ukraine kept up the fight for justice. In 1979, at the trial of Zavaric's commander, a man called Dufanets, and two fellow policemen, Rubachuk and Bubela, details of another atrocity were disclosed for the first time. It led the judges from the courtroom to the hidden site of a mass murder at the village of Tours. For days the site was excavated in search of evidence. When it was found, the graves of over 100 people were discovered. The victims were Jews, murdered by police officers including Zavaric. Was one of 15 cart drivers ordered to transport the Jews from the village to the forest on January the 9th, 1943.
They were taken off the road, and then they were ordered to lay face down in the snow. If someone raised their head, they were struck by the rifles and ordered not to raise their heads. And then they told some of them to get up, and forced them to undress, and some were completely naked. And they were taken to the pit, and some of them, because of the cold, were running to the pit. They were pushed into the pit and shot there. There was about 100 people there, and the shooting lasted about 2 hours. I knew Zavaric. I knew Dufanets. I knew Zavaric because we were shepherds together when we were boys.
This new evidence led to another bid to bring Zavaric to trial. That was in 1983. Again, detailed evidence was sent. Again, Britain did nothing. They didn't even ask Zavaric to sign an acknowledgement of the charges.
I must say that we are surprised by the position of Great Britain, because at some point, Winston Churchill was the man who was one of the initiators of the international treaties, saying that those guilty of war crimes should be passed for trial to the places where they committed those war crimes. However, later on, Great Britain remained deaf to all these agreements. And I must say, our people are surprised at this position.
They were surprised but not deterred. In autumn 1986, meetings were held throughout the Ukraine about alleged war criminals living in various countries. The one man they wanted from Britain above all was Kyrylo Zavaric. The people of the Berlin region wrote directly to Mrs. Thatcher, asking for Zavaric's extradition.
As far as I remember, there was no answer. There was no reaction to that particular appeal.
Naturally, in accordance with the international law and the Soviet criminal code, Zavaric has to be punished for this crime. But for some reason, the British side does not want to solve the problem positively.
For 15 years, the people of the Ukraine have been asking for the extradition of Kyrylo Zavaric. For 15 years, there has been no reply and no investigation in Britain. Now there is the case of Antanas Gikas, living in Edinburgh and accused of war crimes by both the Wiesenthal Center in America and by the Soviet Union. Should a request come for his extradition, if the past is anything to go by, Britain will do nothing.
The British public, and particularly those who were children when it all happened, or not even born, are not, from the nature of things, educated and brought up in the history of what the Soviets suffered. The tale of abomination that was committed by the agencies of the Third Reich, in particular the SS and the security service and the police regiments and the local collaborators hired to do their dirty work for them, passes the bounds of understanding as it almost passes the competence of the human race to relate it in terms that do justice to the foulness of what they did.
If we can get tickets for speeding, I think mass murderers are entitled that government should investigate their charges. It's preposterous for governments to take legal technicalities. For example, should the government of Great Britain or any other government say to us that they don't have an extradition treaty, this is a difficult technicality, what do they have a parliament for? To overcome legal technicalities.
We are very clear that British courts don't have jurisdiction over crimes which are alleged to have been committed abroad by people who weren't, at the time of the alleged offence, UK citizens.
And in this respect, I repeat, it is the Home Secretary that matters, and it's his job to open it up and take it further.
A man has been now given citizenship in Britain, but he's been accused of mass murder, and we ought to be able to furnish the legal technicalities to bring him to justice, or to deport him to the country that will.
They can, if they are resident here, and the information is produced to the Home Secretary, and he pursues it, which he should do, he is entitled, by virtue of an Act of Parliament, the British Citizens Act, Nationality Act 1981, to deprive them of their acquired British citizenship on grounds that they have made false particulars, given false particulars in a material point, not just some little detail about his age, but, for example, by stating when they applied for their naturalization that the applicant was a long-term victim of Nazi oppression, when in fact he was an activist in a special murder execution squad operating under the Germans.
Anyone who's not a British citizen would have to leave the country. They would have the right to quasi-judicial appeal and things of that kind, but they would have to leave this country, and as I recall, they have the right to choose 2 countries who will receive them.
The Home Office has taken no steps, however, to deprive alleged war criminals of their British nationality. In June 1987, the Home Secretary said there was no evidence to link them with war crimes. Previously, he said the evidence was very sketchy. In this film, we have shown information which is anything but sketchy. We have shown first-hand documents and have spoken to eyewitnesses. This kind of information has always been available. No British government has ever bothered to look at it, yet hundreds of lawyers from other countries have.
In the last 5 years, 417 foreign lawyers came to this country. They participated in the interrogation of 600 witnesses. 195 lawyers from this country went abroad. The Soviet Union established relations with boards of justice of the United States, West Germany, Netherlands, socialist countries, Austria.
And now Canada has agreed to work with the Soviet Union. A new law tabled in Ottawa allows Nazi war criminals to be tried in Canadian courts with evidence from the Soviet Union. This is far removed from the policy they took on Britain's secret instructions in 1948.
We have had 40 years of inaction in the matter of bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. The time has come for the government to act on the recommendations that have been made.
Canada is no longer a hiding place for Nazis, but Britain, it would appear, doesn't want to know.
We have to be in a hurry because more than 40 years have passed since the end of World War II. Many witnesses die. We lose evidence. Criminals also die without being punished. And we cannot just watch it happening because that's our duty in the memory of all the victims.
But there will be no question of a trial for Kirilo Zavaric. No question of an investigation by the British authorities, despite the testimony of 76 eyewitnesses who would have given evidence against him. That's because Zavaric died in Bolton in 1984 under his assumed name Petrovsky, without ever having had to answer the charges of his own people of the Ukraine. It could be the same for Antanas Gikas and the 50 other alleged war criminals still living in Britain.
If you but think of the talent, of the geniuses, of the scientists, of the philosophers, of the artists, of the writers, of the poets, and tens and scores of thousands ordinary decent human beings who perished in these genocide acts, one is moved to say, by God, by what right does any man order that to be done to people? It is so ghastly that I do not think posterity can afford to forget it.
In early 1985, following charges in our House of Commons that alleged Nazi war criminals were living in Canada, the federal government established the Deschênes Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals. The commission's job was not to prosecute alleged war criminals, but to determine whether any did in fact live in Canada, how they got here, and how they might be brought to justice. After 2 years of hearings and investigations, the Deschênes Commission reported that of the several hundred cases it had reviewed, it had found prima facie evidence of war crimes in 20 cases, and a further 97 cases in which evidence might be found in Eastern European countries. In a confidential section of the report, never made public, the Commission advised the federal government on how best to proceed. As a result of B-71, alleged war criminals can now be tried in Canada. 2 cases are now before the courts, and other investigations are underway. Canada is also negotiating agreements for the taking of evidence with 7 countries, including the USSR. For the next 2 weeks, Cross Currents focuses on the Middle East. Next week, lightning out of Lebanon. American journalist Barbara Newman describes the spread of Muslim fundamentalism through that ravaged country. There's a visit to the Bekaa Valley and the city of Baalbek, headquarters of the Hezbollah, the Party of God, where some of the hostages are thought to be held. We hope the program will give you a better understanding of what has happened in Lebanon, now the very symbol of chaos, death, and destruction. Here's a preview.
A new terrorism has come to Lebanon. It is terrorism from the Shiite community that targets the West. The Shiites are a Muslim sect, a minority in the Muslim world, but a majority in Lebanon. Nevertheless, they are economically the most disadvantaged group. Now they look to Iran, the leading Shiite nation, for guidance. In all my years of reporting, this is one of the most depressing sights I've ever seen. In front of me was proof of the disintegration of a country. To get from one side of their city to another, these people, loaded down with their few possessions, must pass through 5 separate checkpoints. But once you manage to get across, there are no guarantees that you'll get back. You're looking at a powder keg, a dangerous no man's land, 250,000 Shiites and 10 to 15 hostages, hemmed in by the surrounding Syrian army. The Syrians have made a political decision not to go in. As one intelligence officer told me, we're not going to be dragged in for fear of mobilizing the Shiites against us and endangering the lives of the hostages.
Lightning out of Lebanon, next week on Cross Currents. If you'd like more information about the subjects presented on Cross Currents, we invite you to phone or write for the viewer's guides we've prepared especially for this series. Stay tuned for further details. For Cross Currents, I'm Jim Carney. Good night.
Viewer's guides for each program in the Cross Currents series are available at a cost of $2 each, or $15 for the full set of 10. You can obtain your guides by writing to The Knowledge Bookstore, Post Office Box 94,000, Richmond, BC, V6Y2A2. If you prefer, you can phone the bookstore at one of these numbers, 660-2190, or toll-free, 1-800-663-9711. And you can charge the order to your Visa or MasterCard. Once again, the cost of these informative guides is $2 each, or $15 for the set of 10. Order yours now.